public comment portion and ask if there is any public comment. And no one in the room and no one in the queue, Martha. So I will close the public comment period and move on to the approval of the December 21st, 2020 meeting minutes.
So moved.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
Any comments, corrections, or discussion regarding those minutes? And we are now joined by Ken Rohr, I see. So all in favor of the approval of the minutes?
Aye.
Aye.
Those are approved. We will move on to financial reporting. First item, resolution 2021-01, authorizing payment of the IDA bills. And I have a motion for that.
Them, I move payment of the bills.
I'll second that.
Is there any discussion or questions regarding any of those bills? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Martha, we are getting a lot of feedback here and echoing.
Okay, I will try.
Cash and investment reports. Looking at the cash, we'll start with that and the investment report. Anything you want to call out there, Martha, or does anyone have any questions regarding that report?
Nothing, there's no unusual activity this month on the cash and investments.
Okay.
I will note though that this Tompkins statement is for the full year. So some of you do enjoy looking at that statement and more than others, but that's got the whole year there for you.
All right. And we'll look at the Tompkins in financial report. We've all had a chance to review that. Any questions or comments regarding that?
I looked at the details of the report and everything is a legal investment. So I look at that each month. Everything looks fine.
Great, thank you. All right, and balance sheets and P&L. Anything there, Martha, you want to call out?
Sorry, I'm thrown off because I'm getting the echo too. I don't think there's anything unusual. We're tracking to budget. You look at prior to the investment experience, we're essentially on budget year to date through the first quarter.
Yep. All right. I'm going to, anything else on financials before we move into next item? I'm going to move this around and we'll go to new business first. We're joined by Glenn Kellogg from Urban Advisors. And so we'll do him and then we'll move back to our old business and New York Main Street grant update. So Martha, if you want to intro that.
Okay, right. As you recall, we engaged SWBR and their group, including Highland Planning and Urban Advisors, to conduct an economic development study. So what you have there in your package is the final draft of that economic development study. This again is being conducted in conjunction with the comprehensive plan. What Glenn is going to walk us through in detail, or I encourage you all to review that. And if you have any questions or comments, you have an opportunity before it becomes final to make comments. You can direct them through me and I'll get them over to Don Netzger. But what Glenn's going to walk us through tonight is the impact analysis that was performed. I believe that's page 158 or so. Oh, no, I'm sorry. What page is that? Oh, I'm sorry. Page 100 of your board package is what Glenn's going to walk us through. And this was to identify opportunities for development based on current zoning and demand, or things that could be accomplished should there be some small changes to zoning changes and the economic impact of that. So Glenn, if you could lead us through that, welcome.
Sure. Thank you.
And just
Welcome.
one comment, I believe that those pages prior to that are in I didn't notice a lot of change from what we had looked at the last time in the economic development study. Is that correct?
Right, there were no comments received.
Okay. Okay, sorry, go ahead, Glenn.
Oh, that's okay. I have 2 comments. One, it looks like a lot of the feedback is coming from Ed Russell from my end. The speaker keeps jumping back and forth. I don't know if he's able to mute himself or if somebody can mute him. Secondly, Martha, would you like me to share my screen?
Yes, that would be great. Hang on, let me take care of muting people first. I'll mute Ed. We're good, okay. And then share screen, or wait a minute here. I have to make you the manager or something, right, Glenn?
I think you could just enable participant screen sharing.
First thing I came across was making you a host, so that
There
should
we go. Okay. Woohoo! Let's see if now, there we go. Well, now let me share here. And can you all see my screen here? Okay. How long would you like me to, as a last point of order, how long would you like me to spend going through this? I have a lot of slides here, and I'm wondering how deep you want me to go, and should I skate over the top in the interest of time?
Well, what I would suggest is we have all had a chance to review this, and I suspect that we have. I know that I have. And so we understand what they are, and what I paid attention to on this, Glenn, is where you would, not the graphs and charts so much, but just kind of the recap, or I think it was summary by section.
Sure.
And so maybe if you just kind of focused on those points, yeah, I don't know, give us 15 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever, we don't want to shortchange you or us.
No,
that kind of thing is, I think, that where the meat of this is going to be for us. We can further review the data ourselves then. So
good. Okay, well, let me give you a quick overview of what we're doing here and the methodology that we use. Basically, this is a great big GIS analysis project where we took your tax parcel data and your zoning. And the tax parcel data includes a lot of deep information about how many square feet are built on the site. We took the building coverage to get building coverage on the site. I then went through your zoning handbook online, and you've got a summary table on there. We took all of the metrics from that of permitted lot coverage by zone, setbacks by zone, frontage by zone, and number of floors or height by zone, and put that into tables in the GIS system so that we're able to analyze by your zoning district, sort of the state of what's built, what could be built, and more importantly, take a look at what would be feasible to be built in a range of in a range of your zones. So that's the exercise here. Typically, this is done as a what if scenario, and that's why it's not just a build out scenario. Build out scenarios, almost no place on earth is built out to its maximum capacity. There's always some room to go. What I try to get at with this methodology is what's feasible to be built. of what would it make sense for an investor to go and do under the current situation, and more importantly, if there were changes made, if there were some important changes or policies coming out of a plan, what would modeling those look like? What would be the impact of making that change compared to the status quo? So where it looked like the update to the comprehensive plan didn't have a lot of really specific, at least I wasn't aware of any really specific major impacts. I took a couple of small tweaks of code that I think would take you in a direction toward the objectives that we heard about inclusivity and diversity, and inclusivity thinking about a range, having a broader range of housing products and income levels. So that's where we're going with this methodology. The first thing we did here, or the first thing, I'm not going to worry about the properties that were excluded. We pulled out properties that were not going to make sense and didn't have good data. As a summary note here, I don't know if you're familiar with the work of Joe Minicozy and Urban 3. Just for fun, I went ahead and did an analysis similar to what he presents in a longer summary. Typically in this kind of thing, this is a heat map showing the darker orange color is where there's more intense things. Typically in a downtown, what I expected to find here was that it would be your B1, LD, CD districts, your village center that was the most valuable land, or that was that had the highest value per acre, meaning that you were probably collecting the most tax per acre on those places, and it's not. Actually, in Fairport, like the per acre value generator for you is that historic neighborhood just south of the village square, where you have, and this becomes important later, where you start to see that area is mostly non-conforming in a lot of other ways. Your code is not set up to support or build more of what you have in that neighborhood. But that's the neighborhood that is producing the highest tax revenue for you per acre. So jumping down to some of the summaries, the existing parcel by zoning summary, this is just an overview of what's existing right now. That there's currently, you can see the breakup by acres, the number of properties. Your flood zones are in the CD and M1 districts. And I've included the amount of built square feet in each, the assessment. And also, interestingly, I went ahead and did the average value per square foot, where you start to see that your M1, your industrial district, makes sense, that buildings there are worth about $30 a foot, and compared to RD, where you have some new development in townhouses, that's worth the highest at about 102. Obviously, you're mostly a residential community. You don't have a ton of vacant or divisible land, as I think is best described by the summary chart here. There are other communities where there's a lot more vacant land that there's space clearly to be built, undeveloped lots. Most of your lots have some kind of development on them, whether it's maximizing the value or not is not remains to be seen. Actually, one of the interesting things that comes out in this as well is showing how much land is really in the RB district. Now, when you take that and say, well, what are you allowed to build on that vacant land and in those other properties? Here's a estimate of what could come out of that. Out of those, not just the vacant parcels, one of the things we noticed was that there are a lot of parcels that are large that could legally be divided into multiple parcels, primarily in RB, where there are some very large lots with plenty of frontage that can legally be divided. And if you subdivided those, according to the existing rules, you could get 80 more units if everybody with a big yard put an extra house in the big yard. So that's not a really big number, and it also seems relatively sort of unlikely to happen. I don't like this chart. It doesn't tell you very much. Actually, what this really does tell you is the net buildable square feet. Right now, this is the as-is scenario. This is the build-out scenario. If you could build as much as you could on every single lot, compared to what's built right now, where could it go? RB, your basic residential single-family district, has a huge amount of capacity, but there are a lot of caveats to that, because behind that is really the fact that one, your zoning code in residential districts allows for 30 feet of building, not number of stories. So if you have a sloped roof, you've got maybe 2.5 stories. You've got a whole extra story if you built a flat roof that is sort of given away, assuming you've got a sloped roof. So that's a first thing that accounts probably for about a third of things. And then you also just have lot coverage that's unused. Most of what you see in that RB is just houses that don't take, your residential houses don't necessarily take as much space as they are allowed to, particularly in cases where you have houses that are reasonable market-sized houses, but on a very large lot. And the lot would allow you to build more on there, but there's not really a market demand for houses over 5,000 square feet. So that's I think what's explaining that huge amount of capacity in RB. M1 actually is the next place where you do have development capacity. Same thing with RA and RB have kind of similar stories. As I was looking at that stuff and getting into this, I added an extra segment in here that I didn't plan on adding in. It's sort of the non-conforming use section. One of the things I discovered was you have a lot of your existing lots are not conforming to their zoning in one way or another. The things that I decided to test were, because it was coming up as I was running analysis, was lot coverage. And it looks like you've got some, taking a look at this map, first of all, that central district in the middle of town, or just south of the village center, that those historic places with traditional houses on relatively small lots don't meet your lot coverage requirements as per the zoning that you have right now. Likewise, it looks like some of the new development out towards the fringes, I don't know if you can see my cursor, but down here in the southern areas, curiously, that newer development also leaves lots that are non-conforming on lot coverage. I think that's partly because there was green space allotted to the development and given to a home ownership association, but it left the lots themselves configured as non-conforming lots. Likewise with lot size, we see the same sort of thing and in some of the same predictable places. Lot frontage, the same story is kind of playing out. You have a lot of places that the lot frontage, and so lot frontage is, if you're not aware of it, that to have a lot, you have to have, I believe it's, I've forgotten exactly what it was, but I think it's about 100 feet in RA, and it goes down from there as the zoning goes up. But you can see that even in your RA section, there's anomalies where you have a lot of lots that are less than the minimum required lot frontage. And land use, this to me is the most interesting one, because this is the reflection that you have a lot in your RB, particularly in your RB zone. You have a lot of multifamily, or like duplexes, triplexes, and multifamily houses that have been allowed over the years. So many so that you have a lot of non-conforming uses in your RB zone. So totaling all of that, if the non-conforming any is a table of if any of those last were true, then you get to here. such that 48% of your lots are non-conforming. That's not just, and then you can dive into how that breaks up by zone. RA, 67% of lots in RA are non-conforming, RB, 44%. So this looks to me like maybe it's time to do a zoning rewrite or think about tweaking the zones to better match what's actually on the ground, or at least shape the vision that you have as outlined by the rest of the comprehensive plan. Any questions on that so far? Keep going.
Glenn, can you clarify? Is there a code key somewhere for the zoning codes?
Oh,
I may have missed it as I scrolled through.
Oh no, you know what? I'm not sure that I included one. It was if we go back to here, I've got a map of. I've included here the zone, and these red lines are the district boundaries for the zones. So RB is in this district. RA has this boundary. In here is RC. It gets a little bit hard to see at this scale in the downtown with B1. Were you asking for what do the letters mean?
Yeah, the meaning of the letters, because I noticed there's duplicate RAs and REs, and I wasn't sure if that was something that you could forward along. And again, I wasn't sure if I missed it in the slides or not, but
sure. No, you know what? I didn't include it in my slide. I took it as a given that, well, for example, if you're over on the left, these are all of your zoning codes. You have RA is single family. RA through RE are your residential districts where only residential is allowed. Each one of these changes a little bit going up so that RD and RE are the zones that allow any kind of multifamily use. So RA through RC are strictly single family zones. With RB and RB 5030 are the same zone, but have slightly different frontage requirements. So there's technically a different zone. I would be happy to include a definition, or I could even include the spreadsheet that is in your zoning guideline as one of the introductory pages to this that lays out what your guidelines are for each and has maybe a better description of each zone, if that would be helpful.
That'd be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Let's make a note of it here. So that we're all on the same page, as we go forward on that, your commercial districts then are B1 through M1. B1 is your business district. That is your, it's really that Village Crossroads historic village center. Your CD is the canal district that's along the water. LD, I've forgotten what that is. I think it's a design district. Martha?
I think it's limited development.
Limited development.
LD is the landing development district.
Landing development.
Yep.
And then LC, I think, is limited commercial residential. And then M1 is the big one that we're going to talk about. That's your industrial district. There's that whole section on it at the end of this, where I think M1, as you go forward, thinking about where the comprehensive plan usually leads towards zoning adjustments to match recommendations from the comprehensive plan. I think M1 is probably where you want, if you're not going to spend time messing with other things, M1 is where you probably want to spend a lot of time thinking about what happens. Okay, should we continue on to the as of right? The first scenario that we ran was as of right, based on the rules as they are, what is feasible, and not just the build out, but what is feasible to build with a reasonable return. I broke this out in the analysis to have two categories: a highly feasible, things that would be very profitable for a developer to do, and moderately feasible, things that would have a decent return and are likely to happen. And then there are some other things that probably could be scraped together, but we're setting them aside and really concentrating and saying that it's really that other section that is what's likely, what's possible here on a feasibility side. Out of all of the, just aside from square feet, we can also look at it in residential units. since I think a lot of what, two angles of what we're looking at is how many square feet can be built, but also for a particular residential community and looking to increase residential units at affordable prices. Let's look at the units. Just looking at the units, most of the capacity that this is showing is in the RE district. This is, this is the other side of, in terms of square feet of development. One of the big assumptions that goes into this, though, that we should talk, that I'll talk about at the end of this in R1, or in the M1 discussion, is that I had assumed in this analysis that M1 would continue to be commercial, whether it was industrial or office or flex, that it would continue to be commercial. In M1, it is absolutely legal to build residential development. M1 is not constrained. So all of those square feet of commercial potential could be developed as, could theoretically be developed as residential. The one thing that I'm going to ask your advice for later is whether I should revise part of this study to include parking ratios, but let's skip that for now. So this is zooming in. This chart is basically a edited version of the same thing, of net square feet of feasible development by zone, looking at omitting the M district that we're going to look at in greater detail later, and the other districts that have no development. Putting that into tables that get to impact, there's two ways that we've got impact analyzed in here. One is the net value of development. So the net value then is if you had a building that is worth replacing, we're going to assume that the value of that building is subtracted from the new value of the bigger building that's put in. So we're only looking at the change in value. This isn't the building value, it's the net value. So all of that is a benefit for your tax rolls. It's increasing the value of the village's land and assets, and increases the tax roll. So I believe that, you can correct me and I can change this if I got the number wrong, but from public records, it looks like your tax rate, your village tax rate is 1.785%, or at least has been recently. And so applying that to the net value in these different scenarios shows the really huge possible net annual revenue for taxes. Now, there's much of this that is a little bit improbable in this scenario. Really taking a look at the M1, there's a bunch of reasons that this M1, I think we're going to look at later, and it's going to come out. So let's drop that out and just look at these districts for a more reasonable set of what's with less M1. What are some of the impacts? And in this, you've got a net tax benefit of up to 14 million a year if everything gets developed in these categories. And then the next thing is, what are the benefits to having those residential units? That starting out with the high potential development, since I've got all of your faces over here on the right side of my screen, so I can't see my total column. So starting with a high development potential, there's a potential here for 216 units in these categories as under existing conditions. You notice most of that is in the RD area if the garden apartments can go in the RD development scenario. What does that mean in terms of household disposable income? That means you've got, and this is where the economic benefit from those houses comes in. It's not just from the value of the houses. You've got new residents there who have disposable income and potentially can spend more money on retail, trade, and services, expanding the vitality of your village center. So if you have $12 million new dollars of disposable income, about 7.5 of that could go to retail trade. And these numbers are taken from from pre-COVID average spending patterns of what, how much people in the area were spending on retail trade and on food and drink. And then I translate that over there for you at a rate of $600 per square foot into what does that mean for how much space how much new space would that support in your downtown? So this doesn't look like a lot here in the one category, but as you'll see at the end of the report, these things add up that, that this net scenario would say that you could probably support 29,000 square feet of general retail trade and another 3,000 of food and drink. So that's maybe what, one new restaurant from all of these new units and a couple small new shops, which it looks like Caliber may already be developing. I gave you a map over here as well to try to, I like to use the heat map so that in looking at this, we're not calling out any small landowner's site in particular, but we can take a look at this area, that it's this area that looks like it has the bulk of the development potential here. And obviously you'll notice that in the RE section here in this big empty area, there's a shaded spot that I think there's a lot of development that can fill in there. Surprisingly, from here, it looks like there's development potential in the downtown. Part of that might also be because for the business development, I didn't assume parking requirements because it wasn't part of the zoning code that I found. I may need to amend that as a later thought if that's something you'd like me to do. So there were a couple of things that we thought would open up opportunity for development. One of the things that we heard talking to developers was that there's that you currently require 2 spaces per unit. Theoretically, that encourages development to do bigger units, assuming you're not going to build a garage, assuming you're going to do the cheapest parking you can and just have a parking lot with a dedicated space. For each unit, if you have to have 2 units to maximize the development potential, you're going to have the largest units you can. That's not how I ran the scenario, but logically, that's part of what the two spaces feeds into. If you reduce that to 1 space, it actually pairs with a second restriction that I removed in the scenario for multifamily units. And this is specifically for multifamily units. There's a second restriction of no dwelling, that you restrict dwelling units to, I believe, 1 unit per 3,500 square feet of lot of acre of land. So you have a density cap on your multifamily sites. Interestingly, those 2 numbers, the 2 spaces per unit and the dwelling unit cap that you put on, are actually pretty close. They end up capping things in a similar way. So if you take both of those off, we see a bump, particularly, I mean, it's almost exclusively in the RD and RE, or it should be exclusively in the RD and RE categories. Many of these are the same. We should really skip to, because all of this is the total scenario. The interesting thing here is to jump to the net. Of really seeing impact in the RD and RE from changing those regulations. And so the net
those would
impact
be, I'm sorry to interrupt you. The net impact, those are increased units within each of those categories? Okay.
Yep. So basically, this is showing the this table particularly shows the impact of those two changes. The
Okay.
impact of those two changes would be that you could add an additional 228 units compared to, I think we had 400 or 400 or 500 in the original scenario. It basically adds 50% additional capacity to your whole village's feasible development potential, just by changing the parking and that density cap. Still leaving a parking requirement of 1 unit or of 1 parking space, which, by the way, is what we heard from developers, that really people just want 1 parking space, and that's mostly fine. And you can let the market take care of the additional ones. So you're still requiring some parking, just not as much. You can open this up a great deal and get an additional over 200 units on the same land. It's letting you use that land more efficiently. It's encouraging them to do smaller, hence more affordable units. This assumes that the units are going to average 1,600 square feet, which is still fairly large for multifamily units. But I think that's also I think that makes it a conservative estimate.
Glenn, can I ask a question? You work with a lot of communities, and I'm just kind of surprised that developers are saying that 1 parking space per unit, and most, and particularly that size unit, you're going to have at least 2 adults living there, and and are other communities other than densely urban mass transit kind of cities going to that? I mean, this is kind of news to me. I've heard,
incidentally, well, if I may, I mean,
Yeah.
that feedback came from our interviews for this project with developers working close to your community, that they were finding that, well, for example, one of the developers was finding that most of the real strong market was not really just millennials. Actually, empty nesters and retirees were some of the strongest market for the products that we're providing. And they liked to live close to the village, walk to the village. They just need 1 car. They're not commuting every day. They don't really, especially if parking is not tethered to a unit, if they had to pay for it, they wouldn't pay for a second space.
That's just, I find that very surprising.
Incidentally, the number that the market might settle on here might be above 1. It might be 1.2, 1.5, but it's going to be below 2.
Yeah, and I know that the planning board, and Rob can speak to this as a former planning board member, as projects, particularly multifamily, larger scale projects, have come in and have gone to planning board and zoning board for their approvals, have gotten that down to 1.5 based on the availability of other, public parking that may be in the vicinity or things like that. But I can't think of a time that it might have been under 1.5. So.
Yeah, it's an interesting point of discussion, because I always like to assume positive intent, but from a developer standpoint, I think I understand why they're very interested in that number going down.
Sure.
But from an everyday resident of Fairport that certainly has more than, there's 2 vehicles here with 2 working adults, and the vast majority of the folks that I interact with, I would suggest that the number's closer to 2 as opposed to 1, just from the experience that I bring to this conversation. But assuming there may be a potential bias in the developer's perspective, it's an interesting conversation to have. And certainly if we want to make sure that we're as agreeable and amenable to doing business and development as possible. But I guess I'm surprised by the stat, but a little bit skeptical in regards to potential interest.
So part of why I did this was really to demonstrate the benefit of how requiring parking eats into the land lot, and it eats into your development pro forma. If you have to take a third of your land, even if you're allowed to build more, and this is one of the constraints that I built into the model, even if you're allowed to build more, if you have to take 2 units per unit and set aside a third of your land to accommodate that parking, you're still only allowed to do so much development, but now you can't even build everything that you're allowed to build because you've had to give away land to parking. So you end up with this maximizing number of how much can we do and still have parking for it. So that's what I was saying at the very beginning of this, is that if I didn't have to hardwire this to turn out numbers, one of the things that would come out of it, or like if you were looking at a plausible development site and trying to maximize your return on it, it means that you would probably lean towards larger and larger units to make, in fact, the largest units you could possibly sell, which I put at 1,600 square feet. But maybe you could do 2,000 here. You're going to want those units to be really large so that you are only giving away 800 square feet instead of being able of parking land, instead of being able to like have 300 square feet and smaller, or 400 square feet and smaller units. That makes sense. That you're constrained on how much you're allowed to develop because you have to build all this parking that takes up space.
Yeah, absolutely, without a doubt.
So, I mean,
but there's reasons behind that too. But
there are reasons behind that. But this study was largely pointing out what is the impact of that constraint. Like, if you can choose like to leave it the way it is, and this is just if you change that, how much does that open up the gates? And it looks like it opens it up by about 50%, which I thought was, no, that's not nothing. And it's a pretty reasonable improvement in those districts, I think. Should I move on?
sure.
So the next simple change that was considering the impact of allowing accessory dwelling units. This is just something that's been going on kind of all over the United States already, as the United States is slowly getting away from single-family zoning, and the easiest step away from single-family zoning is basically to say, well, we're going to allow carriage houses or accessory dwelling units. So an accessory dwelling unit, I added some of this at the very end, and I probably should have just put this back in the up at the front here. But these are some examples of accessory dwelling units where you've got a single family house and then you're allowed to rent out the garage, basically, or build a carriage house above the garage. And so you've got a unit that could be an au pair unit. You could rent it to a student. It's an additional unit that helps provide income. Some of the thoughts on this are that you could have, this could also help with aging in place. Either that could be a caretaker's unit of somebody who's taking care of aging residents in the primary house, or as they're still in good health, the owners of the house might decide to downsize into an accessory unit, rent the primary unit, and have that as a base income, keeping them going through retirement in their smaller unit and not having to leave the community. So those are some thoughts about it, but it's an easy way that theoretically this would just overnight double your capacity of housing units, but that's not likely. One of the other things that I thought about with the ADUs is you've already pretty much allowed it by the variances you've granted for duplexes and dividing houses in a lot of areas. So a accessory dwelling unit, depending on how you end up defining it, doesn't necessarily have to be separate from the house. If the garage is attached or underneath, it could be there. It could be effectively a duplex with the smaller part of a duplex as a separate unit that's leased out.
Hey, Glenn, does our code currently prohibit accessory dwelling units?
There is no provision for accessory dwelling units that I could find. Martha, you can, or any other experts can correct me on this, but it would take a variance in your code.
Okay.
So anyway, I attempted to model what would happen if we allowed accessory dwelling units. The hard thing was to decide what's the criteria on this. So the most obvious criteria I could think of was, do you have excessive frontage, or do you have excessive space in your yard that is maybe too small to have a whole dwelling to break off and subdivide, but is large enough that if you have 2,000 square feet of excess lot coverage available, that's enough that you should be able to do an 800 square foot unit. And this is where those places happen, which might not be the likeliest scenarios, but the likeliest scenarios probably would be the places right next to the village center where people would want to have an extra unit where it's convenient to just walk to the village center, but that's not where the excess land for this really is. Even so, this suggests that you have to, like, it would be completely feasible overnight to build about 251 accessory dwelling units in these areas. This is where the lots have where there's excess coverage, which means that on a given lot, by your lot coverage, you're allowed to cover that lot with so much building. Where there's excess, that the house that's actually there could be larger. If it could be 2,000 square feet larger, we've decided that it counts for, why not build an accessory dwelling unit? So that's what we've done here. And the accessory dwelling units then, adding 250 units could support an additional 15,000 square feet of retail trade, 2,000 square feet of restaurant use or food and drink uses. And it doesn't have a huge impact on the tax line that based on smaller units that would only have a value of, I think it was $80,000 for small accessory units, that you're only looking at maybe a $300,000 a year impact to your tax revenues, but it has a larger impact just on the capacity for smaller efficient units. The other thing that was interesting was your lot frontage requirement. This was relevant because I'm going to jump down here to the end again and take a look at, you've got a bunch of conditions with really deep and interior lots. That the reason some of these can't be built with more than single family housing is they don't have the lot frontage. But when you take a look at like this lot here, it's completely vacant. Or this lot that has all of this interior land and only a little bit of frontage. I was wondering, these are the sort of things that there are design solutions that can work really well for this, of doing sort of cottage courts or pocket neighborhoods, where in that space, you're allowed to put a little pocket of tiny little units around a green. And you could potentially add a lot more development if you created a district for this or created an overlay or somehow allowed this kind of thing to happen. In looking at that's why I attempted this analysis, but because I didn't change the zoning, most of your zoning doesn't really allow for cottage court development or that density in there. It ends up allowing for dividing up land and doing doing units at the same density that they've already been allotted for in that district. So understanding that this frontage requirement is barely scraping the surface of what could happen if you allowed tiny units in those center courts, you've still got 125 units that could be added in these districts, and you can kind of see where that is. There's a big interior block in here that could definitely be filled in with things, and this is where that zoom in was, up in this RC/RE area up in here. But there's just opportunities to do more. So so this is what would happen on that. You've got the next great big thing to talk about. Oops, I don't really talk about established uses. Sorry about that. This is your M1 district, and the interesting, one of the awkward things about this is that so much of the permitted development is right here. That these buildings, Ledestri and Corning-Topol, have a lot of spare capacity. You could build a lot more on these, and these came up. This is one of the problems with, this is one of the problems of why I said we have to kick the M1 analysis out, because this is unrealistic and it doesn't make sense. It would be very profitable to redevelop the Ledestri Foods site or the Corning-Topol site, but that might be based on their current valuation. I don't know if they have tax abatements or something that are depressing their recorded tax value, but there's a lot of spare capacity in that land, yet it's got an active use. It's not likely, I don't think it's likely to develop, unless you know more than I do. I don't think it's likely to be developed in the near future. And you can see breaking up M1 by land owner, Ledestri, Corning-Topol, and the village of Fairport are really the primary landowners in the district. So understanding that, these are the net square feet that correlate particularly to these dark things. Like over 1 million net square feet could be built on the Ledestri food site. So my analysis in this basically drops that out. And let's pull that out so we can let's look at the other stuff. Even with the other stuff being the village of Fairport's land, American Park Place. So the other things we took out were, I think, I listed it here. Oh, the Fairport Cannery site that I believe is already being developed, if I've got that right. So there's no point in adding that into a impact analysis because that's happening. So let's not look at that. We've got the village land, American Park Place, Station Warehouse, NCTV, and then a couple of other properties. Redeveloping that, there's a left on the table is about 1.2 million square feet of development that presumably now is either stories that haven't been built or parking or empty space. The value of that would be $300 million. And the taxable rate for that would be like $6 million. It's maybe not likely that all of that is going to develop. But the point of this, I think, is that there's a lot of spare capacity in this district, even at the even under the existing zoning regulations, without giving them any bonuses for anything. So if you take 250,000 square feet of employment space for the next 20 years, you've still got like 1 million square feet of buildable capacity in this district. If you convert that at 1,600 square feet per unit to residential, that would support 600 new units, which is about what, like 120% of the more than that, it's more than 100% of what the 500 units from the existing scenario would be. You can build this is where you have a lot of capacity to build units. And if you built those units, if you could put 600 units in there, you're talking about some real impact on spending power for your downtown.
And I have a question. How does this, how do you interpret existing vacant underutilized space? This is space over and above that, correct? I'm thinking mostly of American Park Place. And by the way, American Park Place and NCTB are the same owners. I'm not sure about Station Warehouse, but I imagine they would be.
I didn't realize that they were in the data set. They were recorded as different owners, so I put them in. Great. I can merge them together as the same.
I would recommend merging those two, and I'll find out if I can about Station. But the existing building there is woefully underutilized, and I don't know how that. This does not reflect that. So actually, the existing development potential is far in excess of the 1.2 million. Is that right?
Yes. So again, the development potential is going to be not, I don't have a way of knowing, unless an entire building is vacant, if NCTB is 50% vacant. I don't know that. All I know is that it's recorded as having a value. If it's completely vacant, it's something that can show up in the data that I have. But most of my vacancy is understood to be land that has not been built on. So when I talk at the beginning about vacant land, it's talking about land that is undisturbed and hasn't been touched. Like that green, like in the residential, that big green field with nothing built on it. Which is why there's not that much of it. That usually there's something that's been built, but it's far under capacity. What this looks at is with the NCTB warehouse, however much space is recorded there, you could build 46,000 feet more. So if it's vacant, then you can fill that plus 50,000 square feet.
Okay.
That this is the net number. So I didn't have a vacancy study to subtract out vacancy and balance that, but that means that there's potential for new uses that far exceeds 1.2 million square feet. Incidentally, it was kind of interesting that I didn't realize this kind of capacity was available in Fairport. And I'm going to guess most of the market doesn't know this kind of capacity is available in Fairport. That when you start looking at these kind of numbers, going back to the employment growth in Parenton, there are some users who were looking for, or who it should be expected that Parenton is going to attract over the next 20 years, some large employment space users. Some of those might be interested in some of these sites, that these might well be marketed to the larger Parenton marketplace for employment space, especially where it's so close to the amenities of downtown.
When we have an owner that's aligned with that vision.
Yes, well, there is that. Might just take talking to them about what the development potential is, but then they'll think their land is worth more than it is.
Well, that's my hope, that when we have this available information, that we can demonstrate to the property owners here and throughout the village where the real potential is and how that can impact their decisions about the property. So I'm hoping to be able to share this at some point with a small group of those property owners, and bring you back in and coax them along. So yes, definitely.
Well, sitting down with the owners of this and saying, you realize you could build 40,000 more square feet here, right? and and that there's a huge market for residential. And yeah, that hopefully that conversation would go someplace.
Yes, because there's been multiple discussions with one of the large property owners there, and his intentions kind of change. At one time it was going to be residential, and then just warehousing and so on and so forth. So I really think this type of study is going to be very, very helpful for
Good.
those property owners to be able to make those financial decisions.
Mm-hmm. Well, this is where it became obvious in that earlier chart that this is a district that traditional manufacturing is not. There aren't a lot of new traditional manufacturing uses coming in. You've got Ledestri as kind of a legacy, and it's still a huge operation. If they wanted to expand, I think they have room to, but I don't know what their business plans are. But even the rest of this district here, even the little village, the little set of warehouse buildings out here at the end are a great opportunity to. I look at that and think that there's opportunity that they could build more there. They can legally build more on that land. That you can start doing like artist live work stuff where they can continue. It looks like there's some artsy stuff there already, that and like bread bakers and things like that. That you can probably integrate some housing in that area as well, and have kind of a cool little district back there of a place of fabrication and live work stuff. And then there's some odd uses like over here, the pet store. It looks, or I think that's what that is. And
It's Country Max.
oh, that's right. Yeah. So that's the kind of thing that's just, it's just kind of a waste of an asset, if you ask me, that you can build. You're allowed to build so much more. And if you flip that to residential, you would make a lot of money.
As they did just up the hill from there.
Yeah. So having that discussion of, you don't have to change the zoning at all. That I have a feeling people just don't realize that residential is permitted in M1. And you just need a good plan to separate the commercial. If you want to even keep the commercial use, you can do that. You just need to separate, you just need a fire separation if you're going to go up, or a good plan of how you're going to integrate the uses. And you can have your cake and eat it too there, really. So yes, there's huge capacity. I think you should definitely talk to these landowners. And if you'd like me to help with those conversations, I'm happy to. So I've been rambling on here for kind of a while. I've got some summary pages that tally up the as of right subdivision, net modifications, ADU. This is sort of the whole package of all of the different things that we went through. What's the bottom line of the impact of each of these, and the net number if you total them all up.
Okay.
As charts. Any other questions and thoughts? And I have some conclusions in here that really it kind of seems to me like reading your zoning code. It's a really old and conventional code that looks like it was just off the shelf in maybe the 70s or 80s. And I don't think it really matches who you are. That's my opinion. It might very well represent your hopes and aspirations, but it doesn't look like it does. You might want to think about either modifying it or revising it. And with that, M1 is like a district to really think, you don't actually have to change much there, but maybe the perception of it.
That's great. Our board here, comments, questions from anyone? Maybe Glenn, if we could bring that down, your screen down, so we could.
Absolutely. I just need to figure out how to stop.
If you could
oh,
make
here we
me
go. Stop
host
sharing.
again.
Yes. Now I need to figure out how to do that.
I think it's in the participant list.
Yes.
So one of the perceptions in Fairport has always been that, we're 1.25 square miles. Everything is totally built out. We can't build anything new. We just have to focus on repurposing or modifications. But what you're telling us from the inventory that you've done, with some creativity, we do have opportunities for growth.
Yes, the lesson from this is particularly in your M1 and possibly thinking about infilling in your downtown, there's a lot of capacity for new uses and new development within your existing code. Some of the other things that come out of that is that it shows that you've allowed a lot more development in particularly your B1 district than is actually there. But it might not be reasonable, or it might not be your goal to really try to maximize those districts.
Okay, so board members, Donna, thoughts, questions? Unmute.
You're on mute.
There you go.
God, that's only the 10th time I've done that today. No, I mean, I have a hard time talking about or hearing like suggestions on existing residential stock and changing that, because gosh, I don't think I'd ever imagine myself saying this, but part of the stuff that we see is the uniqueness of the village that we like. I mean, to me, the idea of trying to find new residential possibilities in areas where there's not residential possibilities is kind of more interesting than trying to change coding in the existing residential areas, if that makes sense. Just
so,
yeah.
I think that does make sense, and it might not really well reflect some of the things that were in here. I think you saw in the most of the, well, a lot of the growth, particularly with the changes that I was recommending, were in the RD and RE districts. Those are the districts that are currently already zoned for multifamily uses. So implicitly, what this is saying is that the place, I think there was a very light touch on any recommended changes to zoning. All of this was assuming that the character would very much stay the same. I mean, even with the ADUs, the change in character there is you go from there kind of isn't one. You've already done it in most of the village adjacent to the downtown, but that instead of just having a single family house and a garage, the garage now is a unit. That it's not necessarily, you haven't changed the allowable buildable area.
Okay.
Haven't changed it at all. The one place that you would be technically allowing more development, but you're not, like the building envelope that's defined hasn't changed, is in the multifamily zones. And what I was recommending with the parking there was that if you have to build 2 parking spaces, you can't manage on a lot to build everything that you're already allowed to build. That you have to give up land for parking that takes out of your lot coverage. Well, it doesn't technically take out of your lot coverage. There's just no feasible way to do it. If you could do it if you did underground parking, but that's prohibitively expensive. If you did underground parking, then all bets are off and it's not a limitation. But assuming that you're working in the relatively tight margin, they're not that tight. People are building. It's worth building in Fairport. But the point of that was that you can't build everything you're allowed to because of the parking restriction. And that pulling that back lets you make better use of the land. But all of that was really letting you do what you could already do. The frontage requirement is maybe the one that is kind of a bigger issue, because it suggests you really do, I think, have a problem that you've got these interior lots that as you're driving down and experiencing Fairport, you don't really notice what's like at the back of the lots. Like you experience the street with buildings here and buildings here, and you go down the street. There's just this opportunity that you could have more neighbors in cute little things.
Yeah.
But for the frontage requirement.
And if I may, Glenn, on that, the village has done a couple of those because, maybe not to the dramatic size of the ones we've seen, but we've allowed, rear access and being able to done that. But it's been done by a variance, and in general, the village has been very receptive to that. So I think that if those parcels had an owner that was interested in doing something like that, they have lots of ability to come to the village, and think that they have a pretty good chance that with the right design, the thing is going to be approved. And that is something short of a code change to try and put all the limits and restrictions that you would need to do in something like that. So the village has a history of allowing those kind of things with the proper design. And
that's probably how we ended up seeing so many non-conforming uses.
Yeah,
I personally, working in development as well, I have a bias against a variance process because it can be seen as arbitrary, capricious, and can be seen as spot zoning. That if you're not going to be consistent about the rule, then if somebody comes in and is denied a variance, they could likely go to court and show how you've allowed all of these other variances. You have to give them a variance. I mean, that seems like an extreme, but it's a reality.
I mean, that does happen, sure. But I mean, variances are a way of life, but it also seems to me variances are unfortunately kind of a way of life. From my perspective, I'm of a philosophy that it's far better to get ahead of it and just articulate what you really want as a community and say, we want you to do this. If you do this, come get a permit. But if you don't want to do this, then we're going to sit down around your table and wring you dry. Exactly. And I think that we're on the right track for putting that in a comprehensive planning idea, that is part of the vision to do that, but to try and articulate that and change a zoning code to allow it, I'm not sure that I would go that far. But because our developers come in with comprehensive plan in hand, and said, but this is what you said. The planning board is very receptive to that, and that is their guidance as well. So I think it's a great place to address it, and I think it's a great opportunity if a property owner is interested in going that route.
So I bring all of this up mostly because the comprehensive plan, usually with a future land use plan, is the next step after that is usually revising or rewriting zoning code, which is very much what was on my mind as I was looking at this. So I was specifically looking at what changes if the next step is to think about your zoning code and making amendments. What are some of the things that I think you should be paying attention to?
Okay, sorry, Donna, to cut you off, but any more further follow up on any of that? You're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, I didn't want to derail the conversation too much with residential. I guess the other question I had was kind of like, just to kind of get to the bigger pictures, is how does the economic development part of suggestions of like that M1, how does that dovetail kind of with that analysis that we saw in the economic development study?
So the 250,000 square foot number that I plugged in here out of that, the future capacity or the net capacity of M1 was not just pulled out of thin air. It was sort of what ties in from that earlier study of saying, well, what do we think, what would be a pretty good capture of the Parenton market for employment for Fairport? And at like 10%, it would be, I think, 200,000 square feet over the next 20 years. So that's where that kind of dovetails in. That we didn't, if you recall, we didn't see any obvious strong market for new employment uses in Fairport, but in Parenton, there's going to be, over the next 20 years, likely demand for scientific, professional, and technical, mostly probably office flex users. And it's also a category that I think are people who, if they were close to the amenities of the village, would enjoy being close to places to have lunch and get coffee. So I think there is potential there. Now that I have a better understanding of the inventory, I think it's worthwhile to look back at that employment analysis and understand that Fairport might have more than a fighting chance of getting way more than its fair share of not just some of the small users, which is what our assumption was going into this, but with that kind of capacity, you might be able to go after bigger fish interested in coming into to the Parenton area. Martha, you're on mute.
I think especially of that American Park Place property, where you could have a significant employment company with a large employment, but people that also want to live there as well. I mean, you could mix it within that building quite easily. And again, these people are going to be the people that want to be able to walk to all their amenities. They're not going to care if their car is parked 2 blocks away, because they're not going to use it except once a week to go to Wegmans, maybe. You know, so I really think that building, that whole area has a lot of potential. And I think with this type of analysis combined with the economic development study, you know, we can focus in on that and you know, see a vision and work toward it.
I will say, I don't think I've ever seen, well, this isn't fair because I haven't seen a lot of places that have actually implemented it, but live-work units are always popular and do well pretty much anywhere. I think they do exceptionally well in a place like this, adjacent to the downtown. In the M1 district would be great to have sort of place I'd love to live, have 2 floors of living above a floor of office, or if you're works for a professional like me, if you're a dentist or a doctor's office, it works for anything. That's great uses to have in this district.
Donna, did you have anything else that you wanted to cover? Okay, Leslie, you're up.
Well, I have to say, as somebody who's had to work from home for the last 9 months, it sucks. But so I have to argue about that live and workspace argument. It doesn't work.
It assumes you're let out in the middle of the afternoon to go get coffee and go get lunch. And
no, usually I have to make lunch for somebody else. But anyway, like Donna, I see how, and you know, being here a long time, how we end up with lots of, you know, a majority of non-conforming uses, and you know, kind of comes with an old village like we are, you know, long-standing village, and the opportunities that exist, you know, in some of the old manufacturing spaces. I think we've looked at them as a commercial aspect, and there have been some proposals to put some of the residential in some of those spaces that just haven't panned out yet. You know, you dazzled me with lots of numbers, I'll be honest. And
well, you can ignore the numbers and
you know, well, you know, you say 3,300,000 million, whatever the numbers you were saying, residential opportunities that we have if we, you know, stop using Ledestri for manufacturing sauce and turn it into houses and all those sorts of things.
I'm assuming that won't happen.
Well, I agree. You know, I think that yes, we as a board and as the community leaders could think of things more creatively and incentivize things, parcels differently. You know, I worry as we seem to constantly tackle parking shortages from one end of the village to the other. You know, loosey goosey with that 1.5 versus 2 parking spaces per unit. That always makes me scared. And I don't want to sound like a stick in the mud and say, you know, we've got it. We're, you know, we like what we've got, and stop telling us not to change it, you know, because that's not who we are. I want to be. And I guess I have to think in more, I guess, warm up to and embrace some of the concepts that you've given us. How's that? Which is completely mamby-pamby, and I'm so sorry.
Totally fair. Take your, you know what? Take your time. Read it a couple more times, and make some notes and tell me. Get back to me on it.
Thank you.
Of course.
Ken?
Yep, I'm here.
What do you?
I don't know what's
Thoughts
matter.
on
I
this?
can't get the camera to work. So, but at least I'm here and I can see all you guys and listen to the presentation. So, wow, lot of great information, a lot of possibilities that certainly I hadn't thought of. Visiting about residential in the M1 zone, that's never gave that any thought at all. The information is exciting. The possibilities are terrific. And then I think about how the village population as it is might think of this and whether they would be forward enough looking to be accepting of any kind of changes like that. And the one that comes to mind is the whole hubbub about the development of the vacant lot up on Halbert Road, where that's all we were trying to do was build, I think, 3 houses, and there was plenty of room for all of them. And we had the whole south side of the village arguing that we were disturbing the history of the village, and that was just terrible, and we shouldn't be thinking like that. And Sterling's building on Main Street, oh, the Green Monster, it's way too close to the curb. We don't, you know, it should be set back and there should be a yard in the front. And it's that kind of stick in the mud thinking that worries me about moving forward with any of this.
Well, all of these are scenarios and proposals to. Wow, I'm hearing myself back.
Yeah, hey, Ken, I think that feedback is coming from you, Ken, if you can mute.
Oh, I'm sorry.
So all of these proposals are things that had been done other places and seemed like easy kind of baby steps from my perspective. If they're pushing the envelope, that is for you to decide. This is just an analysis of what would happen if. And you might just go back to the initial, you can always go back to the sort of initial as-built to understand the pressure of where, that also will show you where the growth pressure is, where there's pressure for development even under the existing code. Does that help, Ken? You can unmute.
It does. If I put my former village board member hat on, I mean, it's exciting stuff. That the business about the neighborhoods within neighborhoods, that appeals to me. Kevin mentioned there's a few of them in the village now, and they're very, very nice. I could see that in that park that you referenced that's up off of Misty Pine. Though I would also say 10 years ago, we tried to just talk about developing an arboretum in that vacant area. No more development than that, and boy, did we get it from the neighborhood. So if you look at it, there's example after example of great ideas being put forward that somehow get squashed when the village population finds out.
Well,
Well,
NIMBY is strong.
Yeah. It's also sort of why I'd recommend not trying to do that kind of development on a variance where it's up on the board for public discussion and everything gets to go to a public hearing and listen to the neighbors complain about it, as opposed to coming up with a really tight formula that allows the stuff that you want to happen, and the stuff that's out of character can't be built. The stuff that is out of character is the stuff that you want the neighbors to come out and fight. But if it's in character, if it's the cute stuff that people generally want, get it locked into your zoning code as something you can build by right. And then you don't have to have the fight.
The problem with that, and I've been through a number of these comprehensive plans and have worked closely on them, is you're establishing a plan, and regardless of how inclusive you would like to be, it is still a very, very small percentage of the population that has enough interest and has enough vision and foresight to develop this plan. And, so you're doing it with your representative body through the village board. You're doing it through a trying to be diverse, inclusive committee that is developing this plan along with consultants. But there's still 99% of the population of the village that doesn't know that a comprehensive plan is going. Well, that number's excessive, but that don't know a comprehensive plan is going on, don't know what it is. And when that development comes next door to them, they're going to say, how come I didn't know this? I mean, but that's just the way that these things work. So that's where you and I disagree regarding variances and in codifying something when you have just a small group of people doing that. And you really, we can advertise public hearing, we can advertise public meeting, but it's still going to come up that when that particular development comes out, those people need to have the opportunity to come and sit in front of the people making the decision on that and say, this is what I think. Because in the general picture, the bigger picture, well, yeah, I'm all in favor of building one of those little courtyard housing communities. But as Leslie said, NIMBY, until it becomes the ones that is in the backyard of where they live, then they can about, and now it's reality for them. Before that, it's just, oh, that's a great little concept. So that's part of the planning process, and I get it. But
no, it is part of the planning process. Two things that I'd like to make clear on this. One, my understanding is that this analysis is technically outside of the comprehensive plan. Martha, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that, but this is
it is, but
impact.
So much of it is in the residential areas, which is really outside of our work as well.
Well, this analysis is not going up, to the best of my knowledge, this analysis is not coming up to be part of the comprehensive plan. This is supposed to be an analysis of opportunities of what was coming out of the comprehensive plan, of directions you might want to go. Secondly, the comprehensive plan itself, even though it's, when approved, is a legal document, and it's a legal document. It is not entitlements. I mean, like I've been saying, changing the zoning is a different thing than having a comprehensive plan that says this is the direction we want to go.
Okay. Leslie, Ken, anything else? Leslie, anything else? Rob, thoughts?
Unmute here. Glenn, with your expertise, I'm curious if you can kind of pull from your previous experience, your work with other communities, and when you think about our map, right, the space that we're utilizing and trying to maximize, are there examples that you think that you might be able to share? And this isn't something you can speak to this if you'd like to tonight, but I'm curious if you might follow up with examples where an M1 type of space, right? When you look at our map and that opportunity that we've been talking about has been maximized more so than we have. I don't know if it's, I guess maybe what I'm in my mind, I'm thinking like elevations of potential projects that have come to fruition in space, you know, kind of a before and after that might help us market the idea with some of the property owners to make it more tangible and what could be.
I have two things. The first one that just comes to mind is I was in Portland, Oregon in from 99 to 2004, roughly. It was in Seattle for part of that, but the Pearl District in Portland, Oregon. While I was there, it went from a warehouse district. Now that's a downtown major city, but that went from a warehouse district with lots of abandoned space. They put the streetcar through it, and overnight it was like pixie dust. The place blew up into, well, our office was one of the first offices there. We were above a renovated building, and you had young professionals in there. All of a sudden you had antique stores and restaurants, hip new restaurants coming in, just blew up. That's the big scale. On a much smaller scale, there was something I was thinking about what's going on in Rochester on Railroad Street with, that's a much smaller scale, and it's kind of a different thing. But that's where like some of the cool restaurants were opening up, like Bitter Honey, and there's the welding shop that's been there forever, but was expanding next door. There's now like the donut shop, but these old warehouse buildings are starting to take on newer retail uses. There's not much of the residential going on in that scenario, but it is like the changing of this old industrial character into kind of cool new stuff. In a way, you already start to see that in what's going on in your M1 district, where you've got Iron Smoke coming in, and that new, and the caliber development of the new retail that's coming in that's already happening there. So I mean, you can almost just look to what's happening already and imagine that continuing.
Sure.
Imagine it bigger in the whole district.
Similar question. And thank you for that. That's helpful. I will research that Pearl District as well, because I'm not familiar. As far as the waterfront area, the canal area on our map, with that area specifically in mind, and now that you have the benefit of all the data that you've digested and illustrated, thoughts there on opportunities for us in the big, as far as maximizing that space, attracting entities, thoughts in general.
I'm jumping back to take a look at my map and some of the analysis of the Canal District. Oh yeah, because the Canal District actually is everything just over the bridge, isn't it? Before you get to M1.
Yeah, that certainly on the north side, and then on the south side, most of it that I have in my mind is CUD.
Yeah, I don't think there's much left on the south side in terms of opportunity in the CD. I could be wrong, but I'm not seeing a lot. But on the north side, there's a lot of development opportunity, like right on Main Street and off to the sides. So I had assumed in my analysis of this that because of where that was, much of the redevelopment right in there would be commercial. So a lot of that goes into commercial redevelopment, but I think it would not be hard to imagine mixed uses in that district. I mean, that's what it's designed for and what it's set up for. Much of that absolutely could be mixed uses. That would be especially right off of Main Street. And what's the name of that little street that comes off and trails behind? That would be a perfect area to redevelop with. Yes. So Liftridge would be a kind of a perfect area to think about uses like live-work housing, where you've got row houses or something like it that have a couple of floors of residential and then space on the first floor that's commercial. That would be an ideal thing, I think, to put in there. Retail is going to be hard off Main. I think I wouldn't try to put that in there. It's still an area that does have. I mean, it's got capacity for redevelopment. What goes in there? Residential is the strongest market that you've got right now, but keeping in mind there's a long-term market for, there is a long-term market for professional office space.
Okay.
I think keeping that open for either of those is a good idea, but I could definitely when you look at the heat map of where development can be, like that's kind of right in the middle of it. It's pretty underutilized land.
Okay. Last question from me, thinking about the residential part of this.
Hmm?
With you, again, pulling from your experience and other, looking at other maps, but and what has worked in other places and applying it to our space. Do you have any suggestions on ways to grow lower income housing inventory? But, well, that'll be the end of my question. In my brain, I'm thinking smaller unit, multi units, but smaller in scale, 4 to 6 unit projects, and areas when you think of our map that something like that might fit and might work well with the surrounds. But fire away.
I do. I have a number of responses to that. The first one is that ideally, that's one of the things that you can start doing with accessory dwelling units, of adding, like, aside from just having a carriage house, if you have so much capacity that you can have an 800 square foot additional unit in your backyard, that's a sort of thing that allows you to start putting in smaller, affordable units. That's one. I'm also on the board of the Incremental Development Alliance that teaches neighborhood activists and community activists and people who are trying to revitalize their neighborhood how to be developers and how to go and start with small development, taking the eyesore on the corner, cleaning it up, and getting new residents in there and starting to clean up streets one by one. I don't think you really have that kind of a issue here. I mean, your affordability, you have more of an affordability issue than anything. So I do think though that if you've read anything about missing middle housing, I think you're right on in what you were saying about 6 to 12 unit, like 3 to 12 unit kind of buildings. I think you're right on that. That's the kind of thing that in your zoning code, you don't really allow for. I mean, you jump from single family to garden apartments. You don't have much of a ladder for allowing mixed middle, like that missing middle housing. One of the things about allowing exactly what you're saying, to repeat back to you what you're saying, a lot of what you're saying is by allowing things like fourplexes and sixplex units, where you've just got 6 apartments, in like 2 towers of 3 and a common stair and entryway in the middle. Really simple stuff that you see. It's all over Park Avenue. You see them everywhere. It's a really common old building type. Your code you can only build those in RE. Well, you might be able to build them in RD in your zoning code, but it's very limited as to where you can do it. However, those are things that I think maybe you could even think about having separate zoning for. The thing about doing small things like that, where you're just doing 6 units, is that you can build them so much cheaper. You don't have to lease them at the same rate that you do when you build a fancy new building with a layer of parking, and you have to build an elevator and have a lot of common space and make every floor ADA compliant. You can build inexpensive quality, but inexpensive buildings, because it's just like building, your construction type is like building a single family house. But instead of being a single family house, you have 6 people living in it. So exactly what you said, finding the opportunities for those missing middle things. I think the development pressure right now, when you sort of look at these maps, development pressure really is on that north side, in the neighborhoods north of the canal to redevelop. That there are opportunities. There's a bunch of that's zoned RE, and that's already like a great opportunity to build those things if the zoning. I didn't actually look at the property layer information there to see what was coming back out of it, but that's the kind of place that I think duplexes, 4plexes, 6plexes would be a great fit. And I don't think they'd really hurt the character of Fairport. I don't think they'd hurt the character of Fairport, but I'm not the judge of that. And I think they could contribute. That sort of area is located close enough to the downtown that hopefully people wouldn't need as many cars. They'd be enjoying walking to downtown services, and I think it would be a good fit. There's definitely a market for it.
Glenn, I'm sorry to step on your words. RE
No,
is an
that's okay.
option for that for that type of development, as well as RD, or RB like boy?
D as in dog.
Okay. And if you have, just coming out of this conversation, if you have any ideas that bubble up where you've seen development like that work well, would love to learn more about it.
The guy, friends of mine are specializing in missing middle housing. If you look up Opticos Design with an O, Opticos, Dan Parolic he sort of led the charge in naming the missing middle housing typology. And for everybody else, the idea of the missing middle is that the US economy has done really well at producing single family houses and then big apartments and multifamily housing. But there's all this stuff in the middle, going from duplexes to triplexes to small courtyard buildings to the stuff that I showed you about the little pocket park kind of things that are rare to be built in America right now because they don't match zoning codes and they don't match the infrastructure of like who builds them. But when you look at historic neighborhoods, look at Park Avenue, there are 6plexes everywhere, and they were built that way, right next to single family houses, right next to duplexes. That it's kind of a lost art and a lost housing type that helps provide affordable units because you're not in the building class of like type 4 or like you're not in the expensive building class construction. You're still in relatively inexpensive construction, but you're still doing multifamily housing.
It's helpful. Thanks, Glenn.
Sure.
Kevin, that's it for me.
Martha, anything that you want to add before we move on? You're muted.
I just wanted to ask Glenn on the build out of the M1 space. You don't take into account the floodplain there, right? This is just.
Oh, I do.
Oh, you did? Okay.
Yes. If you saw at the very beginning, I subtracted out floodplain.
Okay,
So the way I considered that was that basically in my algorithm there's a place where I subtract out non-buildable land.
Okay.
Technically, by your zoning code, it doesn't reduce the lot coverage. You can still use the floodplain towards your lot, like it counts as lot. Maybe it becomes a parking lot. It's just that you can't build on it. So I counted in, like, if the lot coverage is larger than your buildable land, or than the buildable portion of your lot, it'll reduce it down to the buildable portion of your lot. So I subtract it out. So it's
Thank
accounted
you.
for.
great, thanks.
There were only two districts that impacted. It impacted M1 and I think CD.
Correct.
Yeah.
Thomas Creek. So, great.
Great.
Anything else, Martha?
No, that's it. Thanks.
Well, Glenn, thank you very much. It was very informative. You're very responsive to our questions and thoughts, so we appreciate that.
Please send me any thoughts you have as I revise this into a final draft. Again, Martha, my understanding is that this will not be part of the comprehensive plan that gets passed as a legal document, that it's there for your analysis and edification and understanding the impacts of some of these things as you look forward to what to do with the comprehensive plan.
Right.
Got it.
Yep.
All right. Thanks. We'll let you go.
Thank you much. Have a good evening.
Thank you, Glenn.
Take care.
Thank you.
Okay.
Can I dare ask for a 5-minute break?
Why don't we close the meeting and then
I'm going to
get a
close the
break?
IDA meeting. I
Okay.
have one more business, the old business of New York State Main Street grant update, which is short and sweet.
Right, as I worked with Ed Flynn to confirm eligibility, it looked good. But we kept getting pushback. We kept trying to qualify, and we ultimately are not qualified for New York State Main Street money. And so he recommended that we pursue funding through Empire State Development when they do come out with their CFA process. There's a CFA planning grant that's only 50%, but we'd be eligible to apply for that. So.
Okay. All right. Any other old or new business for IDA?
I did want to mention that you'll be receiving communications from Lily about setting up a governance committee meeting. And one of the things I'm going to ask the governance committee to look at is our uniform tax exemption policy, but I'll have more about that later.
Okay.
GLR at the post office is, they're targeting an April opening, April 15th or thereafter. And I did follow up from our prior meeting with Mr. Casa and, shared our UTEP with him and our policies and procedures. And I haven't heard back from him, but I understand the chair had a conversation with him and he looks like he's going to go in the direction of maintaining the existing property. Is that right,
Yes,
Chair?
yes.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. I'll take a motion to adjourn the IDA meeting.
So moved.
And second? Anyone?
Second. I don't know if I got in on the first or.
Okay.
Yeah, you can put me in there too.
All right.
Wait, who wants the move, please? Who wants to move this? Who was the first? Let's go with Leslie and then Rob.
Yeah.
You got it.
Okay.
Close
right.
enough. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. We're going to recess for 5 minutes and then, so